President, I come to the floor today to talk again about the illegal, totally unjustified and unprovoked and brutal attack on Ukraine by Russian forces. This is the 11th week in a row I've come to the chamber to talk about this because I think it's really important that the American people know what's going on over there and that we rally to the defense of our allies in Ukraine. This week is the 77th anniversary of what's called VE Day. That's the day when the war in Europe ended in World War II, when the United States finally led the Allies to defeat the tyranny of Nazi Germany and liberate millions of people. And then in the Cold War, we led the world again to defeat the encroachment of Soviet communism on Eastern Europe. And again, millions of people were liberated, including Ukrainians. We cannot forget this, because as we look at Ukraine, what do we see? The same thing, people who yearn to be free. That's all they want, is to live in freedom in their own sovereign, independent country. And once again, the United States and our allies in Europe are standing with these Europeans fighting to hold on to their freedom in the face of this illegal, unprovoked, and brutal attack. When Vladimir Putin spoke at ceremonies in Russia this week to commemorate the same VE Day, he used it to justify Russia's invasion, saying, and I quote, "The danger was growing day by day, so Russia gave a preemptive response to the aggression," end quote. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The Ukrainians were never the aggressors. The Ukrainians just want to live in peace with their neighbors, including with Russia. Here's a map of Ukraine today, and this is what's been going on. The dark red you'll see here is what the Russians took in 2014, the year that Ukraine decided definitively they wanted to turn to the West, to be a free democratic country. Russia responded with this, taking over Crimea, taking over the Luhansk and Donetsk parts of the Donbass. The light red is what they have taken in this latest invasion. And what they intend to take, according to their military generals who have spoken, is a much bigger area here. The blue, of course, is where the Ukrainians have pushed back, where they have gone on the counteroffensive and actually pushed the Russians out around Kyiv, around the northern part of the country, other parts, and right now, as you can see, in various parts of the Donbass region, including around this town of Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv is an interesting situation. It's actually a sister city to Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown. And I was on the sister city committee decades ago when we developed that relationship. They have a beautiful river running through the city. It was and will be in the future a beautiful city. But now, as these Ukrainians are in the fight of their lives just to keep their democracy, you see what's happening in Kharkiv. The Ukrainians are beginning to make progress, both to the north of Kharkiv and here to the south and to the east. And it's possible that the Ukrainians could actually push the Russians back far enough so that the city itself would be out of artillery range of the Russians. That would be great, because right now the people of Kharkiv, like so many other people in places like Mariupol, of course, are being attacked by the Russians with artillery every night, every day. So if they could get the Russian forces pushed back beyond that period, they could get relief services into the civilians, food, water, that were previously denied by the Russians. And I think it might also force the Russians to make a decision. They would have to decide between addressing Ukraine's counteroffensive near Kharkiv, that's here, and expanding their forces over here, which they have said they want to do. I think if they do that, expand their forces, they're going to be risking their communication and supply lines here being cut off by Ukrainians. So we'll see what happens. But this is a crucial time in the battle. We're at a turning point. I guess that's really my point. We're being asked to look at legislation that has been sent to us by the administration called the Ukraine Supplemental Funding Bill at a time when there is a crucial battle going on and could be a turning point in this broader war. Last week, I spoke with the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova. I'll be speaking to her again tomorrow morning. She made the point that the Presidential Drawdown Authority, that's the funding they are currently using from the United States, is just about depleted. So it was about $3.3 billion in military aid that the President had the authority given to him by Congress to draw down some of our resources to be able to provide to Ukraine. As of last week, she told me that $3.3 billion is just about completed. And therefore, a new authority is critically needed right now. You don't want to have a gap, particularly with regard to munitions, being able to ensure that the more effective weaponry, the heavy weaponry that they are now using in places like this and here, can continue to have the ammunition that's needed to be able to continue the fight. I also spoke late last week to Bridget Brink. She's the current ambassador to Slovakia and a seasoned Foreign Service professional who the Biden administration has now nominated to be the U.S. ambassador here in Ukraine. We haven't had an ambassador there for well over a year, maybe 2 years. And I have been asking the Biden administration, pushing the Biden administration to send an ambassador to Ukraine for over a year. I did the same with the Trump administration when we didn't have an ambassador there for a while, and even with the Obama administration to try to ensure we had a representative. Why? It's so important to have an ambassador there. You need somebody at the highest level to be able to have the Ukrainian officials have someone they can work with directly who can answer questions, make commitments, be someone who's authorized by the president. It's also helpful to have that information on the ground being relayed straight back to our teams here in Washington. At least 17 other countries, by the way, have returned their diplomatic personnel to the capital, Kyiv. We have not. We're apparently going to do that soon. I hope so. I hope so. And I know that the ambassador nominee would like to go back to Kyiv. I know that a lot of members of the team would, because I've met with them in Poland. They're over here in Poland now for the most part, going into Lviv sometimes. But we need to get back to Kyiv. In terms of what is going on in the battlefield, let's talk a little more about that and the importance of the weapons and material support that we have already provided, and therefore what we must continue to provide. Since February 24th, when this latest Russian invasion began, we have now provided $13.6 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. And this latest request for funding from the White House is for $33 billion, so it's for even more. There were reports that this latest supplemental would be tied to other things, particularly the COVID funding that the administration is also eager to get passed. I was strongly against that because when you tie it up with other things, it inevitably slows it down, and this is absolutely urgent. I was really pleased to see that about an hour and a half ago, President Biden issued a statement saying he now supports separating the Ukraine funding from the COVID funding. I commend him for that. It's good news. Again, we've seen so many times around here, you combine things and it slows everything down. It creates a political football that goes back and forth, and this is desperately needed assistance that's going to determine whether some Ukrainian civilians and some of their military forces live or die, because this aid is so critical to their success. After Vladimir Putin's claim of success during this week's VE ceremonies we talked about in Moscow, it's very likely, in my view, that he's now going to feel the need to call up an even fuller mobilization of his military and engage in even more brutality, if that's possible, against the innocent civilians in Ukraine. So all the more reason for us to pass this latest spending request now, get this military equipment to the Ukrainians who need it so desperately. Some Americans may wonder if we can make a difference in protecting freedom in Ukraine without directly engaging the American military or engaging with Russia. I would say we can, and I would say we have made a difference. The U.S. and our NATO allies and other allies around the world have already made a positive contribution to Ukraine's success in pushing back against the Russians, a much larger army with more weapons of every kind. Prior to the latest invasion on February 24th, the United States and some allies shipped these Javelin anti-tank weapons, Stinger anti-air missiles, and other small arms and munitions to Ukraine. to be able to counter what we thought was going to happen and did, which was Russian battalion tactical groups coming into the country. And it was effective. It was effective in Kyiv. It was effective in other areas of Ukraine to be able to push back, as you can see. These Russian units were essentially light mechanized formations which contain armored anti-infantry vehicles, medium to heavy tanks, along with infantry and light artillery. The first 2 months of the war have proved that the Russians were not very effective with their coordination of these groups. And because of their tactical incompetence, they were largely defeated up here by a more proficient and a more effective Ukrainian military. Their mobility at the tactical level among the Ukrainian armed forces is at the core of the NATO doctrine, something called combined arms warfare, essentially coordinated employment of those tanks, artillery, infantry to defend or seize territory. Since 2014, when Ukraine turned away from tyranny and toward the West and Russia immediately invaded, the threat of a larger scale invasion was clear. So Ukraine's forces began to train and learn alongside U.S. troops and other NATO allies. And again, we worked with them to transition from a Soviet-style military to one that emphasized the initiative of non-commissioned officers and mission-style orders and better coordination between these groups. Thanks to an extensive effort by our military and that of our NATO allies, Ukrainians were able to build a military that was more proficient, tactically agile, and was able not only to withstand the initial Russian onslaught, but defeat Russian forces, including around Kyiv. In the past month, the Ukrainian armed forces have repositioned to the east, taking with them that same tactic, the same coordination, and have provided tactical reconnaissance through drones and have used highly accurate artillery. And in doing so, they have thwarted Russian attempts to gain ground, more ground here in the east. Of course, nothing substitutes for the bravery and grit of the Ukrainian people, and particularly the Ukrainian soldiers, professional and civilian soldiers alike. They are defending their homeland fiercely, and that's the single most important element to their success. But we also owe a debt of gratitude to our troops who trained Ukrainians, many of whom are National Guardsmen, perhaps from your state, and also our British, Canadian, and other NATO partners who helped the Ukrainian military become the effective battlefield force we see today. So I say this because we need to know that the help that we're giving does make a difference, not just in terms of the weapons, but also the training. The training of armed forces and equipping them was done through what's called the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI. It was created back in 2016. I actually modified a McCain amendment to create this new initiative. Since 2016, it has provided $1.6 billion for training, equipment, advisory efforts, command and control functions, cyber defense, and strategic communications. Most importantly, it helped teach Ukraine mobility on the battlefield. Again, a model of warfare that was superior to what Russia had. That first phase of our support included the javelins and the stingers we talked about, then a heavy focus on organizing the transfer of existing stocks of Soviet-era weaponry in Eastern Europe, places like Poland or Slovakia, to Ukraine. But these Soviet-era weapons and munitions were always finite, and the war has exhausted a lot of those supplies coming from these other countries in the region. So this Ukraine supplemental request from the White House is understandably a larger amount because Ukraine now requires heavier weaponry and ones that are NATO standard. So more funds are needed to be able to transport these larger weapons at greater distances and to train Ukrainian forces on these weapons and to continue to replenish them with ammunition. So it's more of a traditional battlefield down here requiring that heavier weapon, more expensive weaponry, and now, again, NATO standard weaponry. While the United States and our allies are providing significant resources to this cause, the costs imposed on Russia are much greater. What do I mean by that? Russia has now committed more than 70% of its total combat power to Ukraine, and much of that has been degraded and continues to be degraded. This raises an interesting point. Let's remember that Russia directly threatened military intervention against a number of our NATO allies, including the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, including Poland, even the UK, and more recently, two countries that are not in NATO but are our allies, Finland and Sweden. Other allies that they have threatened, we are legally obligated to protect if they're in NATO, under NATO Article 5. So downgrading Russia's army in Ukraine and supporting Ukraine's armed forces is a pretty effective way to ensure that Russia does not have the ability to attack NATO and instantly begin a direct U.S.-Russian confrontation, something we have wanted to avoid. And speaking of NATO, it's encouraging again that Sweden and Finland are refusing to be intimidated by these Russian threats and are looking to join the alliance instead. At the end of last week, Finland already conducted military exercises with NATO military units from the United States, the UK, Estonia, and Latvia. I'm proud that we are supporting this effort militarily, and Finland is now upgrading its Air Force. That's good. The Senate should immediately confirm NATO membership of both of these nations as soon as it comes before us. It's important to note that it's not just the U.S. government and our allied governments that is supporting Ukraine in its hour of need. Since this terrible conflict began, everyday Americans across the country have stepped up to provide much-needed assistance to Ukrainian defenders, refugees, and first responders. In March, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine sent out a request for surplus or expired personal protective gear to provide Ukrainian territorial defense forces. They said they needed more protective gear, and we responded. I'm proud to say that Ohio answered that call. Altogether, more than 24 law enforcement agencies across my home state have donated almost 2,000 pieces of personal protective gear, 71 vest carriers, 45 helmets, over 1,800 pieces of body armor. With the help of the Fund to Aid Ukraine, a nonprofit based in Parma, Ohio, this badly needed equipment will soon make its way into the hands of brave Ukrainian defenders who are fighting for their lives as they endure Russia's brutal assault. This organization has also given 24 pallets of supplies, over 7 tons of medical supplies to Ukraine. I'm grateful for everyone who stepped forward, especially to those law enforcement agencies that have stepped forward to help those Ukrainian law enforcement entities and first responders and territorial defense troops who need better protection. And this is happening all over America. Additionally, there's a group in Cleveland called MedWish. They're amazing. I got to go visit them last month. They're a very effective nonprofit that has worked for years to provide medical supplies, hospital supplies to countries that have suffered, say, from a natural disaster, but also, in the case of Ukraine, of course, from war. They have partnered with a group called the United Ukrainian Organizations of Ohio, headed by my friend Marta Lisaneski, to provide individual first aid kits and other medical equipment to Ukrainian first responders, defenders, and civilians. And Cleveland-based COACOR is delivering 17,000 individual first aid kits to the front lines. This is a company in Cleveland that is a safety management company, so it's a good role for them. They're doing it, again, as volunteers and donating this. When I was on the Polish-Ukrainian border in March, I saw Marta and another Ohio friend, Andy Fute, who's president of the Ukrainian World Congress, in action, organizing some of this equipment that was coming into Ukraine, and particularly helping the refugees coming from Ukraine. One of my own staffers, Josh Prest, recently volunteered to transport some of this assistance to Europe. He checked an extra bag on his flight so he could carry more individual first aid kits, and he delivered them as well. Again, there are thousands and thousands of Americans doing these sorts of things. As Russian forces intentionally target Ukrainian civilians to spread fear and panic, this display of generosity from the people of Ohio will reassure Ukrainians that America has their back. With this donation, Ukrainian first responders running into the rubble of schools, apartment buildings, and homes will be able to save more lives. I'm very proud of how the people of the great state of Ohio have given their time and resources to help those in need. Tonight in Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown, we've organized a fundraiser under the leadership of Susie DeYoung for what's called World Central Kitchen. They do great work all around the globe, including here in the United States in response to natural disasters, working with FEMA. But they are doing amazing things in Ukraine. The funding is going to go for the fundraiser tonight to World Central Kitchen and also to the Kharkiv sister city efforts I talked about earlier. I've seen the good work that DC chef Jose Andres and his brainchild World Central Kitchen is doing. When I volunteered along with a few of my colleagues at a World Central Kitchen location serving food to refugees at one of his 60 pop-up kitchens in the border areas between Ukraine and its neighbors. Tonight in Cincinnati, chefs from our entire Cincinnati region are volunteering their skills and some great food for the people of Ukraine. All of these donations are a reflection of how the American people are united in support of Ukraine. On the sanctions front, I hope we can focus more of our attention on energy. I believe the top priority of all Ukraine's allies should be cutting off the funding of Putin's war machine. The single largest source of that funding is, of course, their energy exports from Russia. Europe relies on these energy exports from Russia. They purchase approximately $870 million of energy from Russia every single day. That's one reason the ruble has regained some of its value, because these energy receipts are coming in to fund Russia's government and fund the war machine. For Europe, it's about $22 million worth of coal every day, $415 million worth of oil every day, and $433 million in natural gas every day. Again, funding Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine. I've talked about this on the floor before, but Putin has long used energy as a weapon, and we've got to put an end to it. I applaud those European nations who have recently taken steps to find alternative sources of energy and transition away from Russia. For example, recently Italy, which relies on Russia for approximately 40% of its natural gas, is actively working to secure new natural gas contracts with African nations. And in the last month, Lithuania became the first European country to halt the import of all Russian gas. The EU took its first tangible step away from Russia fuels last month when it finally agreed to ban coal imports from Russia. This is expected to take effect in August. As part of their efforts to mark VE Day on Sunday, the G7, which includes France, Germany, Italy, Britain, Canada, and the U.S., pledged to ban Russian oil. Well, that's good. But let's be sure that this pledge is converted into reality. We've seen agreements before with the EU on this topic, and yet we need to be sure we see actual action. A total embargo on all energy, oil, gas, natural gas, coal, is needed. And the United States has the energy resources, especially liquefied natural gas, to be able to substitute for what Russia has been sending to Europe. To be there for Europe, the United States must immediately expand our oil and natural gas production here and build the associated energy infrastructure that will allow our hydrocarbons to reach the global market. Reports are showing that last month, in April, European LNG import terminals, so bringing liquefied natural gas into Europe from the United States, but also from the Mideast, took in a record amount, hitting their highest level since the start of the pandemic. We've got to continue to build on that trajectory. We've already got a general agreement in place with the EU to do that, but certain countries have blocked its implementation. More generally, we've got to support all of our domestic producers here in the United States through a robust, all-of-the-above energy policy that includes renewables, fossil fuels, carbon capture technologies, nuclear power, hydropower, hydrogen, and energy efficiency, all of the above. Instead of making it more difficult for domestic energy production, I urge the Biden administration to reject their proposed tax increase on energy production proposed in the president's budget. Stop restricting new leases on federal lands and waters for oil and gas production, and help with the permitting of the needed infrastructure, instead of proposals like rewriting the definitions of the waters of the U.S., which would add significant time and complexity to permitting new energy projects. This is a time when we need to focus on how to help Europe get away from their dependency on Russian energy in order to stop fueling the Putin war machine. I've mentioned sanctions over these past 11 weeks, from trading sanctions and eliminating Russia's preferred tax status to the U.S., to banking sanctions to crush President Putin's financial services economy. But we should and must go further, especially when Russia not only continues its onslaught on Ukrainians' defensive combatants, but on their non-combatants, on civilians. What they are doing, in so many instances, is clearly war crimes. I call on the International Criminal Court again, which has announced an investigation, to follow in Ukraine's footsteps and immediately begin a war crimes tribunal. The evidence of war crimes is now clear. There should be no delay. Earlier, I spoke about the investment the United States has made since 2015 in training Ukrainian troops and modernizing its military. We now know that investment's paying off because Ukrainian troops have outmaneuvered and pushed back on Russia's military. Speaking to the current Russian invasion, one Ukrainian officer told us, quote, "The biggest mistake the Russians made was giving us 8 years to prepare for this," end quote. Thank goodness we had that time. We could have used it even more productively, but we were able to make great progress. I close tonight on this because it shows why U.S. leadership around the world is so important. Without the bipartisan action of Congress and multiple administrations, including the Obama, Trump, and now Biden administrations, what Ukraine is achieving would not have been possible. That's why it's so important we take up this Ukrainian supplemental immediately, this week, and pass it into law. We have made a difference. We can continue to make a difference, but we're at a crucial point in this war. So much more needs to be done. But you know what? I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because of what we have all seen. Over the past 2 months, the resiliency and fortitude of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people, it has shown the world what patriotism and bravery truly is. I yield back my time.